Do you know Martin Luther King? He was the famous Black American leader of what's called the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So he was talking to, uh, he was campaigning to get Black people to have equal rights with white people in America. It's a problem still today with things like Black Lives Matter. But anyway, he was perhaps the most famous leader. He and Malcolm X uh, were the big leaders in the 1960s. He was killed uh, in the late 1960s. But his famous speech is the "I Have a Dream" speech. You might have heard of that, and you can look it up on YouTube if you type in Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream," and you can watch the whole thing. It's got a very moving speech. But what's really interesting about his speech, he gave it in front of, I think, 250,000 people in Washington, D.C., out in the open. And he gave a big speech and it was on TV. But what's amazing about the speech, well, one thing amazing about the speech is some of it was improvised. Improvise means just thinking at that moment, not planning. Um, Apparently he had a speechwriter, and this is what all these words here. If you want to read it, you can. But he had a speechwriter whose name was Clarence Jones, and they'd written a speech, a long speech for him to give at this protest march, talking about all the things they'd already decided what to say. He and the first it says the first few minutes of King's speech follow the script. He has a script, and he keeps looking back and reading verbatim. Verbatim means word for word. But and he starts reading, and I guess the audience, one of the members in the audience or behind him is a gospel singer called Mahalia Jackson, who had heard Martin Luther King speak before, and said, "Hey," she shouts out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And then Martin Luther King pushes his prepared speech to the side, thinks about it for 6 seconds. He goes quiet for 6 seconds, and then he delivers the most powerful part of the speech, one of the best speeches in the 20th century. So it's like a heckler, somebody who's shouting, "Hey, hey, what about the dream? Tell me your dream." I don't know if he'd prepared it beforehand and had just decided to start talking, or he just formulated it in his mind then. But in front of 250,000 people, he just started talking an improvised version. And what he said was the most famous words of the speech, which I've put in bold here. Let me zoom in. I won't try to sound like Martin Luther King, but maybe this is the most famous part, right? So he looks up. So there's a 6 second pause before King looks up at the sky and says, "I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today." And it goes on and talks. But that was the most powerful part. And it was not planned. It was not written down anywhere. Maybe he'd thought about it, but he was just able to do that. How was he able to do that? That's a good question. He was a preacher, like what do you call a preacher? A religious person who gives speeches every Sunday. So he was a good speaker, but he hadn't planned this, and he's in front of 250,000 people and the TV cameras, and the whole world is, or feels like the whole world is watching. And he just made it up as he was going. I mean, amazing. I would be too scared, maybe. But these improvised words, improvise means not planning, these not planned words became the most famous and the most stirring emotional words that he ever spoke. So there's a lesson there, maybe, that improvising is sometimes better than planning. I know Japanese are often very good at planning, especially Japanese business people. Plan, 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 plan. When I was working in Japanese businesses, there was a lot of planning. And one thing I noticed different with English people is English people don't plan so much. They sort of improvise and guess. Sometimes it works very well, sometimes it doesn't, to be honest. Maybe the Japanese system is better. But anyway, I'm interested in improvising. Let's have a look. 3 questions. Right. First of all, number 1. Is Martin Luther King famous in Japan? Is he relevant to Japanese lives? I don't know if Martin Luther King is very famous in Japan. Do you know about him? Was his message of racial equality, is that important to Japanese? Number 2, can you think of any examples of when improvising is better than planning? Well, that says planning. Planning. When is it better to just improvise and make it up as you go along? Or is it always better to plan? What do you think? Finally, number 3, is improvising a useful skill? Is it useful to improvise, to think on your feet? If it is useful, how can we get better at improvising? What can we do to be able to just speak to lots of people without thinking? Could you do that? How could we practice? Those are my questions. We'll talk about it when I see you next. See you soon. Good luck. Thank you. Let me stop that. Okay. Thank you very much.